In the spring of 1983, in western Kansas, the land looked like a promise that had already been broken. Fields stretched across 640 acres of dry, stubborn soil, cracked like old porcelain under a pale sky. The wheat had come in thin that year, and the corn stood uneven, some stalks tall and proud, others barely reaching a man's knee. Prices had been falling for 3 straight seasons. In town, men spoke in numbers that felt heavier than the sacks they used to carry. 2010s a bushel, then $1.85, then worse. People said farming was about control. Control your timing, control your inputs, control your output. The ones who worked harder, who harvested faster, who maximized every acre, they were supposed to win. That was the belief. But on a quiet stretch of land just outside Dodge City, one farmer began to wonder if that belief was the very thing burying them all. His name was Daniel Harper. Daniel owned those 640 acres outright, inherited from his father in 1979, along with a rusted John Deere 444E tractor, a grain elevator contract, and a way of thinking that had been passed down like a family recipe: plant more, harvest more, sell fast. By 1983, that recipe wasn't working anymore. That spring, Daniel ran his numbers like a man counting breaths. Corn yield projection, 120 bushels per acre. Market price trending toward $2 per bushel. Fuel costs for harvest rising. Labor, himself, and one hired hand. If everything went right, he might break even. If anything went wrong, he would fall behind. Again. The county extension office kept repeating the same advice. Maximize output. Don't leave anything in the field. Harvest everything you can. But Daniel noticed something strange. Every farmer around him was doing exactly that. And every farmer around him was getting poorer. The grain elevators were full. Trucks lined up for hours. Prices kept slipping lower, like sand through open fingers. That's when Daniel started looking at the fields differently. Not as something to extract from, but as something everyone else was extracting from at the same time. He walked his land late in the evenings, boots crunching against dry soil, the smell of dust hanging in the air like a warning. He would stop beside certain rows of corn and just stand there, staring at the ears. Good ears, sellable ears. Ears that, according to everything he'd ever been taught, should never be wasted. But a thought began to take root. What if the problem wasn't that farmers weren't producing enough? What if the problem was that they were producing too much? By June, the rains had come late, but steady. The corn thickened. The wheat held just enough weight to justify harvest. Across Kansas, there was cautious optimism. Maybe this would be the turnaround year. Daniel didn't share that optimism. Because if everyone harvested everything, prices would fall even further. One evening, leaning against the faded red barn his father built in 1952, Daniel held a single ear of corn in his hand. He turned it slowly, feeling the kernels under his thumb. Each one looked like money. But what if leaving it behind was worth more? He didn't say it out loud, not yet. The idea sounded too close to failure, too close to something people would laugh at. A farmer who doesn't harvest his crops isn't a farmer. He's a cautionary tale. Still, the numbers wouldn't leave him alone. 640 acres. 120 bushels per acre. That was 76,800 bushels. And if every farmer in the county was doing the same, what would any of it be worth? The wind picked up that night, rattling the loose tin on the barn roof. Daniel set the ear of corn down on a wooden ledge, right beside an old brass pocket watch that had belonged to his father. The watch didn't work anymore. It had stopped sometime in the late 1970s, frozen at 3:17. Daniel kept it there anyway. A reminder that timing was everything. He looked back out at his fields, rows upon rows of green, stretching into the dim horizon. And for the first time in his life, he asked himself a question no one around him dared to consider. What if the smartest thing a farmer could do was nothing at all? In the fall of 1983, the laughter started small, like a crack in dry soil, and then spread. At Miller's feed store, where men gathered before sunrise and after dusk, Daniel Harper became a story people told with a smirk. Someone would lean back against the wooden counter, spit into a coffee can, and say, "Heard Daniel's thinking of leaving corn in the field." Another would shake his head, slow and deliberate. That boy lost his numbers. They all knew the rules. You plant in April. You pray in May. You harvest in October. You sell before the price drops again. Simple as that. Break the sequence, and you weren't just wrong, you were reckless. Daniel still showed up at the store. Same worn boots, same denim jacket, same quiet way of listening more than talking. He'd pick up seed catalogs, check diesel prices, and nod at the same men who now watched him like he'd already made a mistake that hadn't happened yet. "Danny," old Mr. Collins said one morning, tapping the counter with a nicotine-stained finger, "you don't leave money standing. That's not farming, that's wishing. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded, paid for a new set of belts for the combine, and walked back out into the wind that always seemed to carry a little more dust than it should. On his land, the corn had matured clean and full. Rows stood tight across 640 acres, kernels packed and ready. His John Deere 4440 had been serviced in September. Oil changed. Filters replaced. The combine sat under the shed, waiting like a tool that had only one job: harvest. But Daniel delayed. Week 1 of October passed. Neighbors began running their machines day and night, headlights slicing through the dark like moving constellations. Grain trucks lined the county road. Prices dipped from $2.05 to $1.92 per bushel. Still good, people said. Move it while you can. Daniel watched the board at the grain elevator tick downward, one fraction at a time. He wrote the numbers in a small notebook he carried in his back pocket. 76,800 bushels potential. At 2 5s equals $157,440. At 1.92s equals $147,456. $10,000 gone in a week. He walked the rows instead of driving them, pulled back husks, checked moisture, listened to the wind move through the leaves like paper rubbing against paper. On October 12th, his hired hand, Caleb Rains, finally said it out loud. We're late. Caleb was 26, strong, efficient, the kind of man who trusted engines more than theories. He leaned against the combine, arms crossed, eyes on the field. Everyone else is halfway done, he said. If we wait any longer, we risk rot. Storm comes through, knocks half this down, we lose everything. Daniel nodded like he agreed with every word. Maybe, he said. Caleb frowned. Maybe? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass watch, still frozen at 3:17. He rubbed the glass with his thumb, then looked out across the rows. What if losing some of it, he said slowly, is the only way to save the rest? Caleb let out a short laugh, not unkind, just disbelieving. You sound like those folks on the radio talking about set-aside programs. Government paying people not to farm. That's not us. Daniel didn't answer right away, because that was exactly what he had been reading about. Buried in a stack of extension newsletters and USDA bulletins was a program most farmers treated like an insult. Acreage reduction. Payment in kind. The government would compensate farmers for leaving part of their land unharvested to reduce surplus and stabilize prices. Most men saw it as surrender. Daniel saw it as leverage. That evening, he spread the papers across his kitchen table. Numbers, percentages, eligibility rules. He ran calculations under a single hanging light bulb, the hum of it filling the silence. If he left 20% of his corn unharvested, he could qualify for compensation. If enough farmers did the same, supply would drop, prices could rise, but the risk sat heavy in his chest. What if others didn't follow? What if he was the only one leaving crops in the field? Then he wouldn't be clever. He'd be ruined. Outside, the wind picked up again, bending the tops of the corn just slightly, like the field itself was unsure which direction to lean. Daniel folded the papers, set them beside the unmoving watch, and stared at both. Time and timing. One you couldn't control, the other you had to choose. The next morning, instead of starting the combine, Daniel drove into town and walked into the county office. Behind the desk, a woman looked up over her glasses. Can I help you? Daniel placed the forms down carefully. I want to enroll, he said. Her eyebrows lifted just a fraction. You understand what that means? Daniel nodded. It meant leaving part of his crop to rot, on purpose. Back at the farm, Caleb watched as Daniel marked off sections of the field with wooden stakes and red ribbon. Clean lines cutting across acres of perfectly harvestable corn. Tell me we're not actually doing this, Caleb said. Daniel tied off the last ribbon, stepped back, and looked at the divided land. We're not harvesting that section, he said. Caleb stared at the rows that would be left behind, then back at Daniel. They're going to laugh, he said. Daniel gave a small, almost invisible smile. They already are. He slipped the brass watch back into his pocket, the weight of it steady against his leg. For the first time, the plan wasn't just an idea. It was a line drawn in the dirt, and once you draw a line like that, there's no stepping back across it. In the winter of 1984, the farm didn't sleep. It recalculated. Snow came thin across western Kansas that year, more wind than white, sweeping over the 640 acres and settling into the rows Daniel had marked months earlier. The unharvested corn stood brittle now, leaves curled like paper left too close to flame. Some stalks had already given in, bending, breaking, surrendering to time. Neighbors called it waste. Daniel called it inventory. Inside the barn, beside the idle John Deere 4440, Daniel built a different kind of machine. Not made of steel and belts, but of numbers, timing, and restraint. He started with a ledger. Page 1. Total acreage, 640 acres. Corn allocation, 512 acres harvested, 128 acres unharvested, 20%. Average yield harvested land, 118 bushels per acre. Total harvested bushels, 60,416. He ran his finger across the figures like they were rows in a field. At the current market dip of $1.78 per bushel, that harvest would bring in $107,540. Less than last year. Less than what he needed. But that wasn't the full picture. He flipped to page 2. Government compensation estimate PIC program equivalent, based on withheld acreage and historical yield. Projected value, equivalent of 15,000 bushels. Not harvested. Paid anyway. Then came page 3. Market response scenarios. If regional supply dropped by even 8 to 10%, prices could rebound to $2 of $1 in tins, maybe $2 of 125 cents. If that happened, his stored grain could be sold later. Not at harvest. But after. This was the system. Not harvesting wasn't the strategy. Timing was. Daniel didn't sell immediately. Instead, he stored the 60,416 bushels in 3-grain bins behind the barn. Old steel cylinders his father had installed in the late 1960s, each holding just over 20,000 bushels. He checked moisture levels daily. Target, 13.5%. Any higher and mold risk climbed. Any lower and weight loss cut profit. He installed a small aeration fan system, rigged from salvaged parts, to keep airflow steady. Nights were cold enough to help. Days were watched carefully. Every decision now was a delay. Caleb didn't like it. Grain's meant to move, he said one morning, kicking at frozen dirt near the bins. You hold it too long, you're gambling. Daniel adjusted the vent on one of the bins, listening to the low hum of air moving through corn. Selling early is gambling too, he replied. Just feels safer because everyone does it. In town, the story had shifted from laughter to curiosity. Some farmers had quietly enrolled in smaller acreage reduction plans. Not many. Maybe 5 out of 40 in the county. Most still harvested everything. Trucks still lined the elevators, though not as long as before. By February, the price ticked upward. $1.78, $1.19, and $1.97. Nothing dramatic, but enough to be noticed. Daniel didn't move. He wrote each price in his notebook, the same one he'd carried through the fall. Numbers stacking like layers of soil. March came with a dry wind and a different tone in town. At Miller's feed store, conversation slowed when Daniel walked in, but not out of mockery anymore. Out of calculation. Mr. Collins leaned in this time, voice lower. You still holding? Daniel nodded. Collins scratched his chin. Price might hit 210. Maybe, Daniel said. What are you waiting for? Daniel thought of the watch, of 3:17, of the idea that the exact moment mattered more than the movement itself. Not the price, he said. Collins frowned. Then what? Daniel looked around the room, at the men who had harvested early, sold early, and were now watching the numbers climb without them. I'm waiting for everyone else to run out. Back on the farm, the unharvested 128 acres had turned into something else entirely. The corn left standing had dried, some fallen, some still upright like forgotten markers. Wildlife had moved in, deer tracks cut through the rows, birds scattered at sunrise. To most eyes, it looked like loss. To Daniel, it was part of the system doing its work. Reduced supply, less pressure on the market, a quieter kind of influence. By late March, the price crossed $2.12 per bushel. Caleb came running from the house with the radio in his hand. It's moving, he said. We should sell now. Daniel stood by the bins, one hand resting against the cold steel. Not yet. Caleb stared at him. What else is there? Daniel looked out over the land, past the bins, past the broken rows, toward the horizon where the sky always seemed a little too wide. There's a point, he said quietly, where the price isn't just rising. He paused. It's searching. Caleb didn't understand that. Most people wouldn't. But Daniel had built something over the winter that couldn't be seen from the road. A system based on absence, on patience, on knowing that in a market where everyone rushes forward, the one who stands still long enough starts to control the direction. In the spring of 1984, Daniel Harper stopped watching the market like a gambler and started working it like a mechanic. The snow had cleared early, leaving behind a dry crust that cracked under each step. The 640 acres began to shift again, from dormancy to preparation. Caleb had already serviced the planter, checked seed plates, greased every joint like it was muscle returning to motion. But this season, Daniel wasn't just planting crops. He was refining a method. Walk with me, Daniel said one morning, handing Caleb a measuring rod marked in inches and fractions. They moved into one of the harvested fields, where the soil still carried the imprint of last year's rows. Daniel knelt, scooping a handful of dirt, letting it fall slowly through his fingers. "Top 2 inches, he said. Too loose. Wind took it." He pointed farther down. 4 to 6 inches still holding structure. Caleb shrugged. "That's Kansas, always been that way." Daniel shook his head. "Not always. We've been stripping it too clean. Too fast." That was the first adjustment. Residue management. Instead of clearing every stalk after harvest, Daniel left controlled debris across sections of land. Not randomly, but in calculated strips. Every third pass of the field was left with partial cover. Purpose: reduce wind erosion, retain moisture, stabilize topsoil for the next cycle. It slowed planting. It complicated machinery paths. But it changed the ground itself. The second adjustment came with spacing. Standard planting density in the county was around 30,000 seeds per acre. Daniel cut it to 24,000 on selected plots. Caleb frowned when he saw the numbers. "That's less yield," he said. "Per acre," Daniel replied, "not per plant." With wider spacing, each stalk had access to more nutrients, less competition, deeper root development. Fewer plants, stronger plants, more resilient to drought. This wasn't about maximizing output. It was about stabilizing it. The third adjustment was timing. Instead of planting all 640 acres in a tight 10-day window like most farmers, Daniel staggered it across 28 days. Early plots, mid-plots, late plots. If weather shifted, not everything would be affected equally. If prices shifted, harvest windows would spread out. Risk distributed. Caleb leaned against the truck one afternoon, watching Daniel mark another section with wooden stakes. "You're farming like you expect something to go wrong," he said. Daniel didn't look up. "I'm farming like it always does." Then came the most controversial change: partial intentional loss. Daniel set aside another 15% of projected acreage not just for government programs, but as a built-in buffer. "Loss we choose," he explained, "instead of loss that chooses us." Caleb let out a long breath. "You're planning to lose money." Daniel finally stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "I'm planning to control where it's lost so I can control where it's gained." They installed new moisture probes in the soil, simple metal rods connected to handheld readers. Not advanced, but enough to track consistency across different sections. Target moisture for planting, 50 to 60% field capacity. Anything below that, delay. Anything above, risk compaction. Daniel tracked it all in the ledger. Dates, depth, spacing, weather patterns. Every variable became a lever. By May, the first shoots appeared. Thin green lines cutting through brown earth. The early plots came up fast, fueled by a brief stretch of rain. The mid-plots followed more slowly. The late plots waited, almost hesitant, until a second wave of moisture passed through. From the road, Daniel's farm looked uneven, patchy, uncoordinated. Neighbors drove by and shook their heads. "He's out of sync," someone said. "He's experimenting," another replied. Neither quite understood, because what Daniel was building wasn't visible in a single moment. It only made sense across time. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the fields into long shadows and gold edges, Caleb stood beside Daniel and looked out across the staggered rows. "You think this works?" he asked. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out the brass watch, still frozen at 3:17. He held it up against the horizon. "It already is," he said. Not because the crops were perfect, not because the prices were certain, but because, for the first time, every part of the system was connected. Soil, timing, supply, loss, patience. A farm wasn't just land anymore. It was a series of decisions stretched across seasons, and Daniel had stopped making them the way everyone else did. By the summer of 1986, time had begun to stretch in ways that made quick judgments look foolish. 3 full seasons had passed since Daniel first tied that red ribbon across his field in October of 1983. What once looked like hesitation had slowly turned into a pattern. What once looked like loss had started to leave a trace. But time does something else too. It tests whether an idea was luck or structure. That summer came in hard. June temperatures climbed early, pushing past 95 degrees before the soil had fully settled from spring planting. Rainfall lagged. By mid-July, the county reported less than 60% of expected moisture levels. The wind carried heat like it had weight. Across western Kansas, fields began to show it. Corn leaves curled inward by noon. Soy patches thinned. Wheat yields came in lighter than projected. At Miller's feed store, the tone had shifted again. Not laughter, not curiosity. Concern. "Gonna be a short year," someone said.
Prices will spike, another replied.
Only if there's anything left to sell, came the answer. Daniel didn't speak. He listened, the same way he always had, collecting words the way he collected numbers. Back on his 640 acres, the difference wasn't dramatic at first glance. It was subtle. The early planted sections struggled, just like everyone else's. Leaves tightened under the heat. Growth slowed, but the mid-season plots held longer. And the late planted sections, they were just beginning to establish when the worst of the heat hit. Their roots reached deeper into soil that still carried moisture from the staggered spring rains. Where others had synchronized their vulnerability, Daniel had spread his. Caleb noticed it first. These rows, he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his neck, they're not dropping as fast. Daniel nodded, crouching beside a plant, pressing his fingers into the dirt. Still damp beneath the surface. Not better, Daniel said. Just different timing. That was the point. Not avoiding bad seasons, but refusing to let one moment define the entire year. By August, the numbers started telling the rest of the story. County average projected yield, down 22%. Some farms reporting losses up to 35%. Daniel's projections. Early plots, 25% yield. Mid plots, minus 12% yield. Late plots, minus 5% yield. Blended across the 640 acres. Total reduction, approximately 14%. Still a loss, but controlled, and more importantly, predictable. Meanwhile, the market reacted. Corn prices climbed sharply. 2.12 12 34 sevens $202.58 per bushel. Supply tightened faster than expected. Elevators that once overflowed now sat half empty. Farmers who had sold early watched the climb with quiet regret. Farmers who had lost too much had nothing left to sell into the rising market. Daniel stood in between those two outcomes. Not untouched, but positioned. He began releasing grain in stages. First sale, 10,000 bushels at $2.41. Second sale, 15,000 bushels at $2.52. Third sale, 12,000 bushels at $2.60. He didn't empty the bins. He paced them, each transaction written carefully into the ledger. Each decision tied not just to price, but to what remained. Caleb watched the numbers come together one evening at the kitchen table. "You lost less," he said. Daniel nodded, "and sold higher." Another nod. Caleb leaned back, shaking his head slowly. That wasn't luck. Daniel looked at the brass watch resting beside the ledger. Still frozen, still constant. "No," he said quietly. It just took longer to see. Outside, the fields moved gently under a cooler evening wind, the worst of the summer finally beginning to loosen its grip. From the road, Daniel's farm still didn't look perfect. Still uneven. Still different. But over time, different had started to mean something else. It meant surviving when others dipped too low. It meant earning when others had already exited. It meant understanding that a farm wasn't a single season's outcome. It was a sequence, and the ones who lasted were the ones who learned how to move through time without letting it rush them. By the fall of 1989, the pattern had hardened into something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. 6 years had passed since Daniel Harper first left corn standing in the field. 6 years of small adjustments, quiet decisions, and numbers written carefully into a ledger that had grown thick with use. The county had changed in that time. Not dramatically, but enough. Some farms had expanded, buying up land from neighbors who couldn't hold on through the mid-decade pressure. Others had sold out entirely, their fields folded into larger operations that ran on tighter margins and heavier machinery. Bigger combines, faster harvests, more output. The same belief, just scaled up. Daniel hadn't expanded. His 640 acres remained exactly that. But what he extracted from those acres had shifted. That year, conditions started nearly perfect. Spring rains arrived on time. Soil moisture stabilized at 55% field capacity across most plots. Planting followed his now standard staggered schedule. Early, April 10th to 18, mid-April 20th to May 2, late May 8th to May 20th. Seed density remained split, 24,000 per acre on 60% of land, 28,000 on stronger sections, and reduced density experimental strips at 20,000. He was no longer testing ideas. He was tuning them. By July, the crops looked strong across the county. Even the skeptics admitted it. This one's a good year, people said. And that was the problem. Because good years had a habit of becoming crowded years. Supply surged, expectations rose, and prices began their slow slide even before harvest started. $2.48 in June, $2.31 by late July, projected to fall below $2.10 by October if yields held. At Miller's feed store, the mood was confident but cautious. Move fast this year, someone advised, lock in before the drop. Daniel listened, then drove home and opened his ledger. He drew a line across a fresh page. 1989 plan. Total acreage, 640. Projected yield, 130 bushels per acre, above average year. Then he wrote something that would have sounded absurd just a few years earlier. Intentional non-harvest, 18%. Not because of government incentives this time, because of the market itself. Caleb stared at the number when Daniel showed him. 18, he said. That's more than before. Daniel nodded. Bigger supply year, he said. Needs a bigger correction. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. Or a bigger mistake. Daniel didn't argue, because the risk had grown. What worked in a weak year didn't guarantee success in a strong one. That fall harvest moved quickly across the county. Machines ran from dawn to midnight. Grain flooded the elevators. Prices dipped exactly as predicted. 2.12 cents. $2.575. $108.90. Daniel harvested 82% of his land, left 18% standing. Again. This time, fewer people laughed. Some watched. A few copied. But not enough to change the full weight of the market. And that's when something unexpected happened. A late October storm rolled in from the north. Cold, sharp, early. Temperatures dropped below freezing 3 nights in a row. Fields that had been pushed to harvest late were hit hard. Moisture levels spiked in stored grain. Some crops still standing suffered damage. In town, the tone shifted overnight. Loss reports came in. Storage issues, spoilage, delayed transport. The system strained. Daniel stood by his bins, checking seals, monitoring airflow, adjusting vents. His grain had already been stabilized weeks earlier. Moisture, 13.4%. Temperature, controlled. Storage, intact. Caleb approached, hands in his jacket pockets, breath visible in the cold air. "We got lucky," he said. Daniel shook his head. "No," he replied. "We got earlier." That was the difference. Not prediction. Positioning. By November, prices began to recover slightly due to localized losses and storage disruptions. 1.98 stuns, $2.07 stuns, $2.18. Not a dramatic spike, but enough. Daniel sold in phases again. Carefully. Measured. Never all at once. Meanwhile, the 18% left in the field told a quieter story. It had absorbed the storm, taken damage, reduced total supply just enough to add pressure back into the system. A loss that contributed to a gain. Caleb looked out over those rows one evening, frost still clinging to the edges of broken stalks. "I think I get it now," he said. Daniel didn't respond, because understanding didn't come all at once. It built slowly, season by season, like everything else on the farm. The brass watch rested in Daniel's hand, unchanged, unmoving. A reminder that while time kept going, its value depended entirely on when you chose to act. And by 1989, Daniel Harper wasn't reacting to the market anymore. He was learning how to lean against it. In the summer of 1991, the system broke, not all at once. Not with a single storm or a single mistake, but in a slow, grinding way that made it harder to see and harder to escape. It started with rain. Too much of it. May brought steady showers. June doubled them. By early July, western Kansas had already exceeded its average seasonal rainfall by nearly 40%. Fields that once cracked under drought now held water like shallow lakes. Soil structure softened. Root systems struggled to anchor. At first, people welcomed it. Better than dry, they said. But then the signs shifted. Corn leaves yellowed at the base. Fungal patches appeared. Low-lying areas drowned entirely. At Miller's feed store, the tone carried something new. Unease. "Too wet," someone muttered. "Roots can't breathe," another replied. Daniel listened. But this time, his system didn't give him an easy answer. Because everything he had built depended on managing variation, timing, spacing, controlled loss. But excess water ignored those boundaries. It didn't arrive in phases. It didn't respect staggered planting. It settled where it wanted. And it stayed. Back on the farm, Daniel walked the fields with slower steps. Boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The early plots suffered first. Roots shallow from early growth now waterlogged. The mid-plots showed uneven stress. The late plots held better but not immune. For the first time in years, the differences between his sections didn't feel like advantages. They felt like fragments. Caleb didn't hide his concern. "This one's bad," he said, kicking at a patch of mud near the lower field. "We can't drain this fast enough." Daniel nodded. Drainage systems on the farm were basic. Shallow trenches. Natural slope, enough for normal seasons. Not for this. By mid-July, losses began to show in numbers. Projected yield reductions. Early plots, minus 40%. Mid-plots, minus 28%. Late plots, minus 18%. Worse than 1986. And this time, there was no clean advantage. Then came the second problem. The market didn't react the way it had before. Because this wasn't a local event. Reports came in from across the Midwest. Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, all dealing with similar conditions. Too much water, too much loss, but spread across too large an area to create a sharp supply shock. Prices moved, but slowly. $222.36 toners, $2.36 toners. Not enough to offset the damage. Daniel stood in the barn one evening, ledger open, numbers written but not yet connected. 640 acres. Projected average yield now closer to 95 bushels per acre. Total output, roughly 60,800 bushels, but with higher spoilage risk, higher storage costs, higher uncertainty. Caleb leaned against the doorway. "So what's the move?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer right away, because for the first time since 1983, he didn't know. The system he had built wasn't failing, but it wasn't enough. Not for this. Outside, rain began again, light at first, then steady, tapping against the metal roof like a clock that refused to stop. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass watch. 3:17, unchanged, but for the first time it didn't feel like a reminder. It felt like a question. Had he been controlling timing, or just surviving it? By August, parts of the field had to be written off entirely. Standing water killed entire strips, mold risk increased across stored grain from previous reserves, and the unharvested buffer sections, they no longer reduced supplies strategically. They simply added to the loss. Caleb said it bluntly one night. "This is where it breaks, isn't it?" Daniel looked out into the dark, where the fields blended into shadow. "No," he said quietly. "This is where it tells us what we missed. Because every system has a blind spot. And this year, water had found his. In the winter of 1992, the farm grew quiet again. Not the quiet of confidence. Not the quiet of calculation. But the kind that follows something breaking when every sound feels like it might matter more than it used to. The rains had finally stopped by late October, but what they left behind stayed longer. Soil compacted in places it had never been before. Sections of land that once drained naturally now held moisture weeks after the sky had cleared. Grain losses from mold and spoilage cut deeper than Daniel had planned for. Even the ledger felt heavier. Numbers that once aligned now resisted. For weeks, Daniel didn't try to fix it. He walked across the same 640 acres, through damaged rows, across hardened patches, into the sections he had once relied on to balance everything else. Caleb gave him space. "Thinking doesn't look like much," he said one morning, watching Daniel from the barn. "But I guess it's doing something." Daniel didn't answer. Because this time, thinking meant admitting something he hadn't before. He had built a system around supply, around timing, around controlled loss. But he had underestimated one thing: movement. Water didn't just arrive. It traveled. It collected. It reshaped the land beneath it. And his farm wasn't designed to guide it. That realization didn't come like a flash. It came slowly through observation. Low spots where water pooled longer than expected. Subtle slopes that directed flow in ways he hadn't mapped. Soil density differences that changed absorption rates. Patterns he had never needed to see before. Now they were everything. By January, Daniel opened a new section in the ledger. Not yield. Not price, but flow. He sketched the land. Rough lines at first, then more detailed. Elevation changes, water paths, retention zones. He walked each section with a measuring stick and a simple level tool, marking gradients across the acres. Caleb watched him drive wooden stakes into the ground again. This time, not for crops, but for water. "You planning to farm rain now?" Caleb asked. Daniel gave a small nod. Yes. That spring, 1992, before a single seed went into the ground, Daniel reshaped the farm. Not with large machines, not with expensive systems, but with precision. He dug shallow diversion channels across key slopes. Width, 18 to 24 inches. Depth, 10 to 14 inches. Enough to guide excess water away from vulnerable sections. He reinforced low areas with packed soil ridges. Height, 8 to 12 inches. Not to block water entirely, but to slow it, to redirect it, to give the land time to absorb what it could. In sections that had suffered the worst saturation, he reduced planting density even further. 20,000 seeds per acre. More spacing, more airflow, lower fungal risk. And then, he changed the most important rule. For the first time since 1983, Daniel did not plan intentional loss. Not in acreage, not in yield. Instead, he shifted the idea. Loss would no longer be something left behind. It would be something redirected. Water would take it, instead of the crops. Caleb noticed the difference immediately. "You're not marking off sections," he said. Daniel shook his head. "Not this year. So what's the plan?" Daniel looked out across the land, now traced with subtle lines and channels, barely visible unless you knew where to look. "The plan," he said, "is to decide where the problem goes before it shows up." Planting followed. Still staggered, still measured, but now guided by something deeper than timing. Guided by movement. When the rains returned in late May, they came steady again. Not as extreme as 1991, but enough to test the change. Caleb stood at the edge of one of the diversion channels, watching water move slowly along its path, away from the central rows. Not pooling, not drowning, just moving. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Well," he said quietly, "I didn't think dirt lines would matter that much." Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out the brass watch, and turned it in his hand. Still frozen, still silent. But now it meant something different. It wasn't about waiting anymore. It was about preparing, because time didn't just pass. It arrived carrying something with it. And this time, Daniel was ready to meet it before it spread. By the fall of 1994, the farm no longer looked like something you could judge in a single glance. From the road, it still stretched across the same 640 acres. Same fences, same barn, its red paint faded further by sun and years. Same 3 grain bins standing like quiet sentinels behind it. But underneath that familiar shape, everything had changed. The land now carried intention in places most people never thought to look. Water moved where it was told. Soil held where it used to drift. Crops rose not in uniform lines, but in patterns shaped by years of adjustment. And the numbers told a story no one could laugh at anymore. The 1994 season began balanced. Spring rainfall, near average. Soil moisture, 52 to 58% across most plots. Planting followed the refined structure. Early phase, April 12 to 20. Mid-phase, April 25th to May 5th. Late phase, May 10th to 18. Seed density zones held steady, adjusted slightly based on soil recovery from previous seasons. 24,000 seeds per acre across stable ground. 22,000 in previously saturated zones. 28,000 only in the highest performing strips. No wasted uniformity. Every acre assigned a role. By June, the difference showed clearly. Not in height, not in color, but in consistency. Fields that once reacted dramatically to weather now absorbed it. Rain came, water moved. Heat came, roots held. Wind came, topsoil stayed. Caleb stood at the edge of one of the old low spots, now reinforced and guided by shallow channels. "Used to flood here," he said. Daniel nodded. "Still does," he replied. Caleb looked down. Water was there but controlled, moving slowly through the carved path instead of drowning the crops. "Just doesn't stay anymore," Caleb said. That was the payoff. Not eliminating problems, but deciding how long they were allowed to exist. By August, projections came in strong. Average yield across the farm, 128 bushels per acre. Not the highest in the county, but one of the most stable. Variation between plots, reduced to less than 10%. For the first time in years, the system wasn't just surviving bad conditions. It was performing in normal ones. Then the market did what it always does. It moved. A strong regional harvest pushed prices downward again. $2.36 in June. $2.21 by July. $2.08 projected by harvest. At Miller's feed store, the old conversations returned. Sell early. Move fast. Lock it in. But something had changed. This time, a few voices added something else. Or wait, like Daniel. Not many, but enough. Daniel didn't react to the noise. He followed the system. Harvest began in phases. Storage filled steadily. Moisture levels controlled tightly. 13.3 to 13.6%. Aeration cycles adjusted based on nightly temperature drops. No rush, no panic. Then the shift came. Late October brought unexpected export demand. International shortages tightened supply. Prices reversed faster than expected. $2 and $8, $2 and $24 and $2.27 within 3 weeks. Elevators that had been quiet suddenly filled again, but not with everyone, only with those who still had grain. Caleb ran in from the truck, holding the updated price sheet. "It's moving again," he said, breath quick. "We can unload everything right now." Daniel shook his head. Not everything. He opened the ledger, calculated remaining volume, planned release. First sale, 18,000 bushels at $2.32. Second, 20,000 at 2.44 cents. Third, 15,000 at $2.51. He left a portion still in storage. Always. Because the system wasn't built to catch a single peak. It was built to move through them. By December, the totals settled. Total harvested, 81,900 bushels. Average sale price, blended, $220.41 per bushel. Gross revenue, approximately $197,379. Higher than most farms of similar size that year. Not because he produced the most, but because he chose when production mattered. That evening, as winter began to settle again, Daniel stood beside the barn, the fields stretching out in quiet rows beneath a fading sky. Caleb leaned against the fence. "You ever think about expanding?" he asked. "Buying more land?" Daniel looked out across the 640 acres, then down at the brass watch in his hand. Still frozen at 3:17, still unchanged after all these years. He closed it gently. "No," he said. "Because this," he gestured across the land, "already took a lifetime to understand. The payoff wasn't just money. It wasn't just survival. It was control. Not over the weather, not over the market, but over how he moved through both. And that was something most farmers never got to see clearly. In the spring of 1998, the farm looked quieter than it ever had. Not because less was happening, but because everything that mattered was already in motion. Daniel Harper was no longer the only one farming this way. Across the county, small changes had begun to spread. Not copies, not exact systems, but ideas. Farmers leaving strips unharvested. Others staggering planting windows. A few carving shallow water channels after the heavy rains of earlier years. They didn't call it strategy. They just said something like what Daniel does. Daniel never corrected them, because what he built wasn't something you could copy in pieces. It only worked when everything connected. That year, he planted as usual. Same 640 acres. Same phased schedule. Same quiet adjustments written into a new ledger that had replaced the old one, now filled cover to cover. But something had shifted inside him. He no longer checked prices every day. No longer tracked every movement in the market like it was a signal he had to react to. Instead, he checked the land first. Soil moisture, wind direction, plant strength. Because over time, he had learned something simple. The market didn't reward attention. It rewarded position. Caleb noticed it. "You don't rush anymore," he said one morning, leaning against the barn as Daniel adjusted a vent on one of the grain bins. Daniel smiled slightly. "I used to think speed was safety," he said. "And now?" Daniel looked out across the fields, where early shoots had already begun to break through the surface in neat, quiet lines. "Now I think clarity is." That fall, 1998, came without drama. No drought. No flood. No sudden spike or collapse. Just a steady season. Yield, 126 bushels per acre average. Total harvest, just over 80,000 bushels. Market price, fluctuating between $2.18 and $2.36. Daniel sold the same way he always had. In parts. In time. Without urgency. And when the year closed, the numbers were good. Not extraordinary. Not record-breaking. But consistent. Reliable. Repeatable. That was the real legacy. Not one big win, but a system that didn't depend on one. One evening, as the light faded across the farm, Caleb found Daniel sitting on the wooden step outside the barn, the brass watch resting in his hand. "You ever fix that thing?" Caleb asked, nodding toward it. Daniel shook his head. "No. Why keep it then?" Daniel turned the watch slightly, letting the last bit of sunlight catch the glass. "Because it reminds me of something," he said. Caleb waited. Daniel looked out across the 640 acres one more time. Fields that had once been uncertain now moved with quiet rhythm. Water flowed where it should. Crops rose when they could. And the rest was never forced. Time doesn't decide anything, Daniel said slowly. We do. Caleb frowned slightly. Feels like the weather decides a lot. Daniel nodded. It decides what happens, he said. But we decide what it means. The wind moved gently across the fields, carrying the same dry Kansas air it always had. Nothing about the land had changed in a way you could see from a distance. But everything about how it was used had. Daniel closed the watch and slipped it back into his pocket. Still set at 3:17. Still unmoving, but no longer a symbol of waiting. Now, it was a reminder that the difference between loss and profit, between panic and control, between following the market and quietly shaping your place within it, was never about working harder, or faster, or bigger. It was about seeing clearly what everyone else was too busy to question, and having the patience to act when it actually mattered. The farm didn't end, it continued. Season after season, decision after decision, quietly proving something most people only realized too late. That sometimes the smartest move was knowing when not to move at all.